Hello, and welcome to my YouTube channel, Reading Little Blue Books Out Loud while stoned. This video, we're going to start a new Little Blue Book. And we're going to start Little Blue Book number 1128. And it is titled The Church and the School, written by Joseph McCabe, copyright 1926. This one actually has the copyright date printed in it. And it is already falling apart. Every page is separated. There's the title page. And right there on the back, you can see it says copyright 1926. So here are the chapters. Chapter 1, the moral value of education. Chapter 2, the child under paganism. Chapter 3, education in the Roman Empire. Chapter 4, what the church did. Chapter 5, learning in the Middle Ages. And Chapter 6, the clergy and modern education. And that's modern for 1926. So here we go. All right, first page. Chapter 1, the moral value of education. You have one argument that seriously troubles me, said the distinguished and earnest Christian to me some years ago. The fact that the world steadily improves while religion steadily decays. That fact must perplex every religious man or woman who looks out upon the world without tinted glasses. I claim, and I can conclusively establish, that there was never before on this earth as fine a generation as this unbelieving generation of ours. Wow, that's a pretty bold statement for 1926. Heading into World War II. Well, they never knew it. They had no idea. This character is finest in the least religious countries, and especially in the cities where the men and women who worship God are in a minority, and that those generous impulses which make our age, with all its defects, the happiest and most refined that ever was, arise from humanitarian, not Christian sentiment. Even writers who are not Christian have been puzzled by this seeming paradox. 40 years ago, a positivist writer, Mr. J. Cotter Morrison, wrote a fine and learned work, The Service of Man, in which he hailed the coming of the kingdom of man, which he saw succeeding the kingdom of God. But he thought that the world would have to pay a price for the change. Signs are not wanting, he said, that the prevalent anarchy in thought is leading to anarchy in morals. Let me move my book over a little bit. I have to gather all the pages at once. This sentence was much quoted by the clerical writers as a rationalist admission of our degeneracy. But it is just one of those sentences which show the foolishness of man making concessions to the religious apologist. Not only does Cotter Morrison fail to point out these signs, but the whole of the contents of his valuable work support the opposite conclusion. The book is one long exposure to the moral futility of Christianity. It examines morality in the ages of faith, very thoroughly and mercilessly. And to speak of us as immoral in comparison with these ages is simply amusing. 50 pages after declaring that our skepticism is engendering some anarchy in morals, our moralist, when he comes to face the facts, writes such sentences as these. And we quote, "The age of faith were empathetically ages of crime, of gross and scandalous wickedness, of cruelty, and in a word, of immorality. And it is noteworthy that, in proportion as we recede backward from the present age and return into the ages of faith, we find that the faith rises steadily as we penetrate into the past, almost with a regularity which marks the rise of the physical temperature of the air as we descend into a deep mine. But a neglect and defiance of morality are found to ascend into a corresponding ratio. A progressive improvement has taken place in men's conduct, both public and private, but it has coincided not with an increase, but with a decay of faith. This, beyond any question, is the most moral age which the world has seen. That's a lot to say. Hydrate. This hydration brought to you by Medi. Every theorist about our degeneration thus breaks down when he confronts the facts, and it is misleading to quote the mere rhetoric of the positivist writer without adding the exact historical statements which follow. The same thing is found in Lecky's books, and the clergy, of course, quote the sentiments and ignore the facts. We shall see these facts when the time comes. Here I would point out that if this most delicate of critics agrees with me that this is the most moral age which the world has seen, yet inconsistently talks of moral anarchy, which ought to mean the collapse of a better order, it shows that there is a widespread feeling that the decay of religion might be expected to entail such anarchy. And an important part of the answer to this suspicion, or the solution of this dilemma, is the moral influence of education. The ages of faith were ages of gross ignorance. Ours is the best educated age upon which the sun has ever shone. Man, this guy's full of himself in this one, isn't he? The sanest thinker that America has yet produced, Lester Ward, predicted long ago that general education would raise the race to a higher moral level. In every sound sense of the word, moral. Today, no man can question the truth of the principle he enunciated. This at once cast upon the Christian Church a peculiar responsibility in regard to education. No one will question that very ignorant men and women may have high character, and that very cultivated individuals may have a low standard of conduct. It has been my good fortune to meet every variety of character, of every color of skin, every degree of wealth and poverty, ignorance or learning, and I know as well as any that finesse of disposition and manliness of spirit may be found in $1,000 cottage. What mean and sordid ways may go with complete education. Yet the general truth is inexorable. A nation that is grossly ignorant, to the extent of 90% of its people, is generally a gross nation. Reduce its illiteracy to 10%, and its general standard of conduct rises. Since this truth has been perceived, there is the usual eagerness to claim that the Christian Church long ago knew and acted upon it. Christianity gave the world schools, says H.G. Wells. Christianity is the best friend that learning ever had. Mr. Byron wrote in his last speech, "From extreme right to extreme left, the religious world, the claim is made. And just as I have shown the falseness of the Church's claim to have emancipated women and the slave, so I propose now to show that this claim also is the precise reverse of the truth. Once more, I shall give the historical facts and suggest to the reader that they prove that 1. The pagan power to which Christianity succeeded in Europe had already given the world a fine general system of education. 2. Christianity contemplated the complete ruin of this school system without murmur, indeed applauded its disappearance, and made no effort to replace it. 3. So little was done in the way of education during the 1,000 years of absolute Christian domination that more than 90% of the people of every Christian nation were illiterate and densely ignorant. And 4. The modern school systems, which have opened the eyes of the masses and enabled them to rise, are due entirely to secular sentiment, and their development was in most cases opposed and retarded by the churches. Education is, as I have just explained, not so much a duty and a service to the child as to the entire community. Yet we may first consider the general question of the just treatment of the child. In making the 3 claims mentioned above, the apologist tries to win for his church the high and peculiar merit of having helped precisely the more helpless members of society, women, the slave, and the child, to whose sufferings the callous hearts of the pagans are said to have been insensible. What an irony! I wish there were some recording angel who could lay at the august feet of the Pope and his cardinals a veracious chronicle of what women, workers, and children have suffered since the end of the 4th century. We saw how women fell with the fabric of Roman law, and had to wait for modern skepticism to end her long degradation. We saw how the workers passed from slavery to serfdom, and from serfdom to the degraded and degrading conditions in which the 19th century found them. Who will tell what children have suffered since the golden eagles of Rome were thrown into the dust for priests to trample upon? Children are the guests of humanity, said the rationalist Robert Owens beautifully. But there was, you protest, no need for Robert Owen to discover that, for every Christian in the world had the equally beautiful words of Christ. Yes, I know. Yet somehow, what Robert Owen found 1800 years after Christ had spoken was that most of the children of the Christian nation in which he lived suffered hell. There was a blanched look, the pallor of the slave, on the face of the nation's children. At the age of 6 or 7, such of them as had survived the ghastly perils and illnesses of the dreary, drainless home and the fetid streets were sent to work, and when 12 hours' work a day in a suffocating atmosphere were too much for their young frames, no one then stayed the hand that laid a leather strap or an iron bar upon their shoulders. That was the factory system. You protest. It was recent. Had they, then, been in paradise before? From the 5th to the 19th century, half of them died before they knew the strong joy and early manhood and womanhood. 4 out of 8 were laid in God's acre. The cynicism of it. Before their hearts had known more than the scanty and trivial pleasures of a child in the world of serfdom. Did you ever see Maurice Maeterlinck's beautiful symbolic play, The Bluebird? Dude, look that up and put it in the comment what that play was. How one would love to think that his pretty land of memory, where the dead children played in never-fading sunshine, were a real heaven somewhere for those countless millions of children who have been martyred during the last 1,500 years. But there is no heaven. Their little bones are dust. Their souls never grew to maturity. If by some miracle these children of the past could peep into our world, they would say that the paradise of children had come at last. Our life is dreary enough, heaven knows, for the children of the poor. But there is a concern for the children, a care for the children, a protection of the children from cruelty, a provision of entertainment, a crusade against disease, a scattering of little pleasures, which were never known in the world before. Surely a dreadful age, this godless age of ours. I said never known in the world before, and it must follow that paganism had not these things. We must admit it. This generation of ours has advanced beyond any earlier generation, especially in the most refined mark of unselfish character. The service to children. There is no duet des, I think that's French, when you spend $1 in making a child happy, though the glow of the child's eye, the pressure of the soft little lips, are worth many dollars. But I'm getting sentimental, which would ruin my reputation. Let us turn to the cold, hard facts, which are, of course, more congenial to my temperament. And they are mine too. In justice, both to Christianity and to paganism, we must remember that it is science that has done most to brighten the life of the child, and neither of them had science. We may justly ask, we shall ask in due course, how it was that the world had to wait 15 centuries for the development of these germs of science, which appeared in early Greece. But that is another question. Our world is not merely willing, but able to do for the child what no previous civilization could have done, even if it had dreamed of the ideal. The wealth alone created by modern science is colossal. The United States has a little more than a population which the Roman Empire had in its best days, but it has hundreds of times the collective wealth of the Roman Empire. Education as we have, if as we have it, was not possible until our time. Thus, even what is called the materialistic triumph of our age has a most important relation to our general standard of character. It has enabled us to create an educational system which will, when its errors are eliminated, when it becomes entirely practical and is freed from pedantry and academic nonsense, lift the race to a still higher level. It has made possible philanthropic schemes which dwarf all the charity of previous ages. Yet, when one has made every allowance for our greater resources, it remains true that we have, since we began to discard Christianity, a finer and more generous feeling, as well as a surplus of wealth. Christianity wrought women actual evil. It did nothing for the mass of the workers. And what it pretends to have done for the child, we shall now find to have been as illusionary as all its other social claims. And that's the end of chapter 1. And I think we'll read chapter 2. Chapter 2. The Child Under Paganism. Pardon me. Any properly informed apologist will at this point take down his copy of Lecky's History of European Morals, and he would like to make me blush by confronting me with the admissions of that learned rationalist historian. George Eliot once maliciously said that Lecky's fundamental principles was, 2 and 2 certainly make 4, but it does not do to press these things too far. Many people follow that amiable maxim, but the witticism is not quite just to Lecky. Nearer the truth is the remark which an American consul once made to me, that Lecky tried so hard to stand up straight that he occasionally fell backward. His compliments to the Christian Church are almost always undone by the facts he gives. Lecky dwells on the 3 services of the new religion to the child, which the more cultivated apologist would claim. In point of fact, I am not sure that there is any apologist sufficiently informed to abandon the common claim that Christianity gave the world education, although I ask the reader who has access to a decent library to verify this, as it must seem impossible. There is not one authoritative manual of the history of education which does not make that claim ridiculous. However, apart from education, to which we will come in a moment, the apologist will warmly plead that Christianity rendered to the child 3 mighty services by abolishing the practices of abortion, the exposure of children, and infanticide. And I'm not sure what the exposure of children means, except for being exposed to the world or given up to the world without family protection. I guess that's the way it seems to be for me of what this means. But at any rate, hydrate, because cottonmouth, and because Maddie says so. And now, I shall not linger long over abortion. It is generally to be depreciated on the ground of health and risk. It may, in a nation with shrinking population, which no nation now has, have a social aspect. But it is not, except legally, a crime or a vice. The fathers of the church put it on a level with murder because they thought that the fetus had an immortal soul. We don't. In our age, it ought not to be practiced to any great extent because science has provided contraceptives. You gotta remember, 1926, contraceptives was a new thing, beyond condoms. In the ancient world, it was inevitable, and even in our world, I should call any theologian who forbade an unfortunate unmarried girl to resort to it a moral pervert. They do today. But I dismiss the point briefly because There is not the least positive evidence that the church even reduced the practice. The fathers condemned it, certainly. There was not much in connection with sex that they did not condemn. The Stoics also condemned it. Lecky himself, though he unfortunately leaves all his Stoic quotations in Latin so that the clergy cannot read them, shows that Seneca, Juvenal, and others condemned it. He quotes Favoritus, saying that abortion deserves public detestation and the hatred of all men. One association of doctors in Rome compelled its members to swear that they would never give drugs for abortion, but neither Christian nor pagan affected it. All through the ages it has continued, even now when preventatives are known to everybody. I will give only one fact. In a very large American city, where a third of the populations are Catholics, forbidden to use preventatives, a man of exceptional information in such matters told me that 200 physicians of the city practiced abortion and were sufficiently organized to disarm the curiosity of the police. I love how they put that, disarm the curiosity of the police. The exposure of children and infanticide were real evils of the pagan world. In an earlier volume, I have explained that the old Roman law did not reach across the threshold of a man's house. The father had power of life and death over his wife, his children, and his slaves. The newborn child was brought to him, and he decided whether he would receive it into the family. If he refused to take the baby girl in his arms, she was taken out of the house and laid in a public place, where slave dealers or baby farmers found and reared her. Baby farmers. That's crazy. Legally, the father could have stifled her. Or have her stifled. I guess that's a nice way of saying having her killed. This was barbaric. A relic of the barbaric days of the Romans, which were not far away. But the preacher who imagines Roman fathers callously killing their baby girls or flinging them out into the streets until the Christian church became powerful enough to intervene simply does not know what he is talking about. Even scholars, who ought to know better, grossly exaggerate the situation. Dr. Fairbairn, for instance, shudderingly says of the pagan children, the very sense of their rights was not yet born. The feeling of obligation toward them waited on the footsteps of Christ. He impresses his religious readers by giving a reference to Mommsen, the greatest authority on the Roman Republic. If they troubled to look up Mommsen, which they never do, they would find this. The moral obligations of parents toward their children were fully and deeply felt by the Roman nation. Any authority will tell you that Dr. Emil Reich, the Protestant writer on Rome, says it would be the easiest thing in the world to accumulate examples of the most tender charity practiced by these immoral Romans. Strange, if they slew their baby girls and then showed a most tender charity to other people's children. Let us take first infanticide, which is far more serious than abortion. Most critics of pagan Rome would refer us to Lecky's History, where it is described as one of the deepest stains of the ancient civilization and a crying vice of the empire. The apologist stops there. It is enough for pulpit purposes, but it is constructive lying to quote these phrases alone. What Lecky says is that pagan and Christian writers united in speaking of infanticide as a crying vice of the empire. We passed the Christian writers. They called abortion infanticide. But who are the pagan authorities? And are they merely speaking rhetorically? Knowing how Lecky, who is always sound in his facts, has a weakness for saying things which religious readers like, we are not very much surprised to find that he does not give a single pagan authority for his strong statement. And it is his custom to give his authorities most liberally in footnotes. He quotes two writers of fiction, the comedian Terence and the story writer Apuleius, each of whom makes one of his characters direct his wife to kill a newborn baby girl, and in each occasion, even in fiction, the wife is too humane to do it. Then he quotes Seneca and certain Greek writers saying with approval that portentous or weak and monstrous newborn babies, monstrosities, in short, or defective babies, are and ought to be destroyed. There are plenty of very humane men and doctors who say the same today. Lecky does not give any evidence that the theoretical right of the Roman father to kill was ever exercised to any extent. He says that infanticide never appears to have been common in Rome till the corrupt and sensual days of the empire. He gives no evidence that it was common in those days, and he adds, the legislatures then absolutely condemned it. In fact, on the very same page, he writes this passage, which ought to be studied by every apologist. And here's the passage. The power of life and death, which in Rome was originally conceded to the father over his children, would appear to involve an unlimited permission of infanticide. But a very old law, popularly ascribed to Romulus, in this respect restricted the parental rights, enjoining the father to bring up all his male children and at least his eldest female child, forbidding him to destroy any well-formed child till it had completed its 3rd year, when the affection of the parent might be supposed to be developed, but permitting the exposition of the deformed or maimed children with the consent of their 5 nearest relations. Not so barbaric after all. In fact, Lecky himself gives a case under Augustus, that is to say, in the corrupt and sensual days of the empire, of a father using his legal right to execute a delinquent son, and he says that the act provoked the indignation of Rome. The Emperor Hadrian banished a man who had killed his son for adultery with his stepmother, and the Stoic lawyer Marcanus praised the emperor, saying that the power of a father should be displayed in affection, not atrocity. In fine, we have this singular situation, which Lecky notices without a smile, that one of the commonest ways of provoking a pagan mob against the Christians was to accuse them of infanticide. Strange, if infanticide was one of the crying evils of the pagans themselves, that the mere rumor of it infuriated them. Apart, therefore, from maimed, deformed, or very feeble children, whom the Romans had no science to cure, we have no evidence of this alleged prevalence for infanticide. With the exposure of the new-born female babe, it was different. But even here it is quite false to say that the pagan moralists did not condemn the practice, or that the church caused it to be abandoned, or even materially reduced it. The Stoic lawyers of the 1st and 2nd centuries tried to prevent exposure by making it equivalent to infanticide. It was no Christian, but the great pagan lawyer Paulus, 3 centuries before the church had any influence, who said, "Death is inflicted not only by the man who smothers the newborn child, but by him who casts it away, who denies it food, who exposes it in public places to receive a mercy which he himself does not possess." It was the pagan emperor Trajan who decreed that an exposed child could not be made a slave, and it was the Christian emperor Constantine who reversed this law. It was the pagan emperor Caracalla and Diocletian who attempted to check the traffic in children. Thus it is, as usual, quite false to say either that the pagans did not condemn and try to abolish the exposure of children, or that Christianity did abolish it. It appears only to have terminated with the general extinction of slavery in Europe, says Mr. Lecky. As late as 529 A.D., we find Justinian reverting to the law of Trajan, which Constantine had annulled, and decreeing that the finder of exposed children must not make slaves of them. Clearly, therefore, in the Eastern Empire, which still prospered, children were so freely exposed in the 6th century that the law recognizes and regulates the procedure. In the Western Empire, which was now beggared, miserable, and ignorant, who can guess what the situation was? Thus, three more boasted achievements of the Christian religion are dissolved into mere rhetoric. Stoics condemned what evils there were, just as Christians did, and there is no evidence that Christianity was more successful than Stoicism in reducing abortion and exposure. As to infanticide, there is no historical evidence that it was ever a common or widespread practice in Rome, and there is not the least evidence that in the 4th century, when the influence of the Church began to be felt, infanticide was more frequent before the conversion of the empire than after it. At least, says the apologist, you will not question that the new religion rendered a mighty and novel service to the child by inspiring the establishment of founding hospitals, orphanages, and other charitable institutions. I not only question it, but I laugh at the claim. The man who makes it is as lamentably ignorant of the historical facts as ever. Let us still follow Lecky, because he has carefully studied all the more learned works of Christian scholars, and these older Christian works are better informed and more conscientious than the apologetic literature of our day. 20 years ago, one of the chief religious periodicals in Britain, the Christian Word, observed in its editorial article of August 20th, 1903. Pardon me. Hydrate. That's better. A foremost modern theologian, by no means of the radical school, has recorded his significant judgment that one of the main characteristics of apologetic literature is its lack of honesty, and no one who has studied theology can doubt that it has suffered more than any other science from equivocal phraseology. Cheap apologetic literature, and not a little that is not cheap, is even worse today. The writers copy each other's reckless statements in bland confidence that none of their readers will check the statements or read critical works. The average believer lives in a magic shell of illusions. They still do today. Lecky finds that even the older apologetic writers, who were at least honest, exaggerated the influence of Christianity in the protection of infant life. Instead of the new religion conjuring from the soil of Europe a fragrant crop of foundling hospitals and other charitable institutions, all that the most persevering student can find is this: some trace of one such small institution in Gaul in the 6th, and of another in the 7th century, and a positive proof of the existence of one at Milan in the 8th century. That is the ridiculous mouse which the laboring mountains of Christian research have brought forth. At Rome itself, the city of the popes, almost the one city left in Europe, there was, as the Catholic scholar Muratori has shown, no founding hospitals until the 13th century. The question of hospitals for adults I consider in another book. Hydrate. Against this meager and miserable record of the religion, which loudly boasts that it taught the world the spirit of charity and philanthropy, we can place a brilliant and noble record of pagan benevolence. I tell in another work, Little Blue Book, number 1078, that Imperial Rome distributed food to hundreds of thousands of its citizens every week. The children would, of course, profit by this distribution of corn to their fathers, but even the first emperor, Augustus, provided special funds for the feeding of poor children. It was, however, toward the close of the 1st century, when the Stoic ethic obtained power in Rome, and the practical and inspiring nature of its gospel of brotherhood is evidenced by an outpouring of benevolence without parallel in history until modern times. The Emperor Nerva of the 1st century ordered all the municipalities of Italy to feed the children of the poor, and the Emperor Trajan enforced and extended the law. We know from Pliny that during the reign of Trajan, 5,000 poor children were supported out of public funds in Rome alone. We have recovered a bronze tablet which tells how in the small town of Velea, the emperor found an institution for the support of 270 children. The next emperor, Hadrian, increased the imperial grant to these institutions and founded establishments for poor women. The succeeding emperors, Antonius Pius and Marcus Aurelius, supported and extended the work of imperial and municipal benevolence. I keep forgetting the N in that word. And we have recovered from the soil of Italy an abundance of inscriptions from which more than justify the words of Dr. Reich, that it would be the easiest thing in the world to accumulate examples of the most tender charity practiced by these immoral Romans. Private philanthropy kept pace with that of the Stoic emperors, while Christian writers boast of the few little Reptohopia or orphantropia. Yeah, Brepotropia or orphantropia, orphanages, which a church here and there instituted. Scholars tell us of a general practice of benevolence in the empire a century before any of these Christian groups arose, which is, in comparison, like an arc lamp to a nightlight. Sir Samuel Dill, in fact, now the highest authority on these matters, and no enemy of the church, goes so far as to wonder whether private benefactions under the Antonys, the Stoic emperors, were less frequent and generous than in our own day. This great period of care of the child lasted from about 90 A.D. to 180 A.D., the period when Christianity, a mere collection of obscure groups in still more obscure meeting places, was engrossed in its struggle with heretics. The charities of that wonderful Stoic period far surpass all that Christianity did in the next 1,000 years. Do I forget, you may ask, that the church had not the resources of the Roman Empire? Not in the least. It is the man who put Christian charity above pagan who forgets it. I might, in fact, retort that the papacy, which soon became the wealthiest institution in Europe, did nothing for many centuries except feed its priests. But at least spare us, in these informed days, the legend that Christianity taught Europe to respect the rights and warm the hearts of the child. And that is the end of chapter 2. And that is also the end of part 1 of Little Blue Book number 1128, titled The Church and the School, written by Joseph McCabe, copyright 1926. Thanks for listening, and join me in part 2.